And then, of course, there's the big one, which is the face on Mars, which looks, at least on half of it, to be a human face. Why would aliens who didn't look like us build a human face on Mars? It's almost like you've got a Martian Sphinx there.
Let's go back. I want you to look into a crystal ball, Mike, and tell me if these are all real, structures, artifacts, what you think might have happened and how they may have gotten there.
Well, the reason that they're artifacts is because whoever was living there is now gone. They've left, they've abandoned.
So you're convinced of that?
I'm convinced of that. What that means is that somebody left for some reason. Somebody was here, somebody was operating on the moon, somebody left.
Mining something.
Mining, doing something, or that was just their base of operations for whatever they were doing here on the Earth. And you look at human history and it really doesn't make any sense. The evolution of life on this planet seems to happen just all of a sudden, boom, there's all this life where it didn't exist before. So whatever they were doing, they left, but there seems to be evidence of some sort of solar system-wide cataclysm happening at least a couple of times in our history. And what I suspect that has to do with is that there are missing planets in the solar system. There's one where the asteroid belt is today.
Something blew up there.
Where something blew up or was blown up, and that's pure speculation, but something was there and is not there anymore. And also in the orbit about where Mars is, there should be a planet that is no longer there. And if you look at other solar systems that we're discovering, these exoplanets are discovering, what we're finding is these things called super Earths. So what we have is a solar system with these gas giants, and then we have the rocky terrestrial planets like Earth and Venus, and Mars is considered one of those, although I think it's a moon,
maybe
not a
Venus.
planet. But what's missing is these super Earths. So the interesting thing is that these super Earths would be sort of a transitional planet type between the big gas giants and the traditional Earth-based terrestrial planets, but we don't seem to have those. And they're right about in the orbit where they should be, or at least where they've been observed in other solar systems. So the question is, why don't we have them? What happened to them? And also what we've discovered, or what we think we know, is that they would tend to be extremely unstable. And that might mean that over millions or billions of years, they could go kablooey. And there's 2 or 3 different theories about how that could happen.
Old book called, I think, From the Earth to the Moon, about an ancient civilization on this planet that went to the moon. And that modern astronauts went there and saw this. It's a dramatic story. Very possible.
Yeah, very possible, and I think that's probably what we're actually discovering.
I think that's what happened.
I mean, if you look at NASA again, if you look at the structure, it was basically 3 major secret societies were involved at the very top levels of NASA. When you dig into all those ancient belief systems, all of those 3 secret societies ultimately came to the same conclusion, which is that we're descended from some higher human-like gods that came from the stars, and were here before, and someday are going to return. So you could almost look at the whole Apollo program as an attempt to basically find the proof of that, and go back to the moon, find the artifacts, bring them back, and say, yes, this is true. Yes, we have our proof that we came from the gods, that the gods are really a version of us. And that may be why Neil Armstrong said, it's one small step for man, but one giant leap for mankind. And what he meant was in man, and he didn't say a man. People say he said a man. He did not. He said exactly what he meant to say. Man meaning the greater man that exists out here, but mankind, this specific version of the human race, it's a giant leap for us, but it's a small step for them because they've been here before. I think that was the message, really, ultimately.
And it's going to probably happen again. And again.
And again. And again. And again, yeah.
Which is fantastic.
There's no question the last couple of missions especially Apollo 17, that they went there looking for technology. They went there looking for artifacts. These were like salvage missions in my mind, and I think they were definitely there to grab this stuff and bring it back. And it's really interesting that we did that, because the Hopi, for instance, and this is one of the things I did in the research for the choice, was they had a legend or a myth that says, if you go to the moon, don't bring anything back because it will upset the balance of the world. So it's a little scary to me, because I think we did find some stuff.
Even moon rocks, we've brought them back.
Exactly. It said don't bring anything back, not moon rocks and certainly not technology. I mean, imagine if we were able to bring back something like I don't know, a piece of a robot or a piece of a mechanical device and reverse engineer that, it could really upset the balance, technological balance of our society. And so that's a interesting admonition from the Hopi, and it's one that I hope that we adhered to, but I don't think we did. Not to go back to the Hopi repeatedly, but they talk about the previous world of man that they say was even more advanced than our own world today. So we had higher technology. And when you look at this stuff, when you look at what's on the moon and you look at what's on Mars, it has a familiar feel to it. I mean, as an engineer, I'm an aerospace engineer by trade. As I look at this stuff, it all makes sense structurally. Things are spaced the way they would be spaced if we built them. They look like human architecture.
They're organized.
Yeah, and it looks like human stuff. I mean, there's pyramids that look like our pyramids. There's ziggurats that look like our ziggurats from the Mesopotamia. So it does seem to have a human signature to it. And then, of course, there's the big one, which is the face on Mars, which looks, at least on half of it, to be a human face or a representation of a humanoid face. So why would aliens who didn't look like us build a human face on Mars? That's a really interesting question.
Looks like the head on the Sphinx, doesn't it?
It does look a lot like that, and you know, the interesting thing about the Sphinx is that it's half man, half lion, or it's a lion with the head of a man, and there's this sort of cross breeding that seems to have gone on. And then you look at the face on Mars, and there's work that's been done where you take half of it and flip it over, and one half looks like a human and one half looks like a lion. So it's almost like you've got a Martian Sphinx there. I think one of the early Russian researchers called it the Martian Sphinx. So definitely there's that association that we have yet to figure out the meaning of.
Let's talk, if we can, Mike, about the moon for a while. We both know Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut. And I've asked him specifically if he saw anything unusual on the moon when he was there. I don't think he's holding back. He said he did not. Yet, he's one of the biggest, staunchest believers in alien UFOs, in ET presence on this planet than anybody I know.
Right.
He said, and again, he says, George, I didn't see anything, but I've been told by people higher ups in government and industry, we're being visited. We've been visited. I believe the guy. How about you?
I believe him too, but I think there's you have to take everything the astronauts say with a grain of salt for a couple of reasons. First of all, the majority of them were Freemasons, and this goes back to the dark mission stuff. And what are the Freemasons? They're a secret society, and what membership in that organization demonstrates is that you have an ability to keep a secret. So if there is a secret that is of national importance or even worldwide importance, these are the guys that you would pick to keep a secret, because you can test it repeatedly whether they can keep the secrets of the order. That's one idea. The other thing is that it's possible that he simply does not remember, because the fact is, if you look at the transcripts of the astronauts...
How could you not remember?
Well, it's interesting.
Unless...
If you look at the transcripts of the debriefings from the astronauts, what you find is that they can pretty much chapter and verse go through all of the things that they did. You know, at this point I deployed the ALSEP experiment. At this point I did this test or that test. They have a harder time describing how it felt to be there and what they saw there, what the moon looked like. In fact, Buzz Aldrin very famously was doing an interview just kind of like this back on NBC News, and when he was asked what it felt like to be on the moon, he ran out of the room. I mean, he literally got sick to his stomach and ran out. Now, what I found out in the course of doing Dark Mission is that the astronauts were all, quote, hypnotized during their debriefings in order to, quote, help them remember what they had seen. So was it that they were helped to remember,
or were
they helped to forget? And this goes to another thing that's really interesting, which is Alan Bean. I don't know if you've ever had Al Bean on.
Never had him on the show.
He'd be a great guy to get. He was a painter before he went to the moon and became a painter after he came back, and he liked to paint self-portraits of himself on the moon, and he would paint them up so that they were this very bland, boring, gray, National Geographic landscape like, you know, we've all seen on the moon. But it never felt right to him, so he kept painting and doing more and more versions, and they got more and more colorful to the point where he finally reached the self-portrait that he really liked, and it was full of pinks, like your tie, purple, greens, blues, all this multicolored stuff that does not look like what we think the moon surface looks like.
He's saying these colors were on the moon?
Those were the colors that felt right to him, but he never actually said, this is what I saw on the lunar surface. Now, the interesting thing is when you take NASA scan photographs or even prints. Like there's a lot of people that have original first generation prints, and you scan them in and you amplify the color just a little bit. What you find is that the lunar surface actually has all these colors. It has pinks and blues and purples and lavenders and all these very bizarre, strange colors, which probably has to do with the fact that light is bouncing around above them.
I would think, yeah.
On these,
because we can't see that here.
No, actually, that's not true. Recently, a lot of people have been taking, with ground-based telescopes, been taking pictures of the moon, and they're noticing that there's a lot more color there than they expect. And they're starting to amp the color up, and they're finding that it's all these different multiple colors of the rainbow. Now, there's some interesting theories as to why that is, but I think it goes back to the fact that Alan Bean was never comfortable with the moon looking the way we've told it looked, but he's very comfortable with looking the way we think it might actually look.
So he hasn't done paintings of little spacecraft on the moon?
No, he hasn't done that. He hasn't done that. Although, you know, there are those stories. There's the stories that on Apollo 11 that they landed and Neil Armstrong radioed back on his secret channel that, you know, they're lined up on the edge of the crater, and you think, okay,
looking at us.
Yeah, and you think that's kind of a BS story. But I'll tell you this: I have a friend who worked at NASA at the time, and he said that story was floating around NASA within the hour of them landing on the lunar surface. So if that's the case, that implies to me that maybe there really was a secret transmission like that.
Do you think it scared Aldrin and Armstrong when they were on the moon?
That's a really good question. I certainly, you know, Neil Armstrong is such an enigma. He just never wanted to speak about what he saw.
And Buzz will punch you out.
Yeah, Buzz will punch you out. Yeah. And, you know, the interesting thing, too, is there's no pictures of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface except by accident. They're all of Buzz Aldrin. So all these famous Apollo 11 pictures of Buzz coming down the stairs, it's all Buzz. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, Armstrong was not a Freemason, but Aldrin was a 32nd degree at that time. Now he's the 33rd.
I think Buzz wanted to be the first person on the moon. I think for years it is something that bothered him. I don't think he was very close to Neil Armstrong. These are things I've heard. Great astronaut, Aldrin was, just a great astronaut. But I think he wanted to be the first, and I think he was a little upset with the fact that they wanted Neil, the civilian, to be able to do that.
Well, you know, and I sometimes wonder if, given the Masonic kind of infiltration of NASA, which is something I've written about, that maybe Neil Armstrong's job, the reason he went out first, was so that he could record the first Freemason on the surface of the moon. You know, that might have been the reason.
Take Buzz's picture.
That might have been the reason. I really don't know. And there was only one camera, and it's really interesting. They were only allowed to take one handheld camera. It was black and white television camera, and then the one handheld color camera. The color TV camera, they were expressly ordered, leave it up in the command module and do not bring it to the surface, which is weird.
What was it about Mars that fascinated you?
Well, you know, I think anybody who's ever been interested in science fiction or been interested in space has always been fascinated with Mars. I mean, it's always the planet that everybody thinks is the closest to us, the closest to Earth in terms of its size and its possible habitability and all that stuff. And when we were younger, you know, before we found out some things that we recently found out, it was thought of that there was still a possibility that life could exist there. Actually, it turns out there is life there. We'll talk about that in a bit. But you know, it was just always the place that was the most mysterious. And, you know, there's all the great books, the John Carter of Mars series and all that stuff. And Mars is just a place that's been fascinating to us. And all the ancient cultures had really strong beliefs about it. So it's a fascinating place, and a place that we've always kind of wanted to go, and luckily we've been there a few times.
In Arabic, isn't Cairo, doesn't that mean Mars?
Cairo literally means, the name Cairo literally means Mars, and there are people that say that the pyramids are aligned with Mars under certain solstice conditions, and of course the Sphinx was at one time painted red and was named, I'm not going to pronounce the Egyptian name, but it was basically named after the Egyptian word for Mars as well at that time. So there's a lot of strange associations between ancient Egypt and perhaps an ancient civilization on Mars.
Well, you look at what I call no coincidences. Cairo being Mars, the face on the Sphinx, which looks much like the face in Sidonia, which we'll talk about. Lots of similarities. These things can't be an accident.
No, they really can't be. And, you know, Mars is a place that has always fascinated us from ancient times, and even in recent times, we thought that we might get signals from Mars. There was back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, both Marconi and Tesla believed that they received intelligent transmissions from Mars. And these guys were no dummies.
They weren't dummies.
It's popular now to say, oh, they didn't know what they were listening. They were catching signals from the trolleys that were going over the tracks, a while away. But what most people don't know is that this whole thing about Mars and faces actually goes back to the 1920s. And at that time, Marconi, the head of his company, did a luncheon in New York. It was covered by the New York Times. And he said, we've got a couple of oppositions of Mars. An opposition is basically because Mars orbit is very elliptical, where it's closer to Earth at closest approach. At a certain point. And there was one coming up in 1924, which was the closest one until 2003, so until just recently.
20-some miles, 20 million miles.
34 million miles was the closest approach. But the one in 1921 was one coming up in 22. The guy said, look, it might be an idea now that we have radio to send radio signals to Mars and see if we get an answer back. And he suggested we send some kind of a Morse code, dots and dashes, like with, that would spell out the word tree, and then send them a picture of a tree and dots and dashes and a man and all this kind of stuff. So nothing, as far as we know, was done on that. But then in 1920, so the 1922 opposition came and went, and as far as we know, nothing happened. But then in 1924, the close approach, the 34 million mile approach, the Naval Department asks all the people that are operating radio transmitters and receivers at that time, and there weren't that many, to have a day of radio silence. And what the idea was is that every hour on the hour for about 10 minutes, we would send up these receivers, all the other radio stations would stop transmitting, and we would listen for signals from Mars. We point the antennas at Mars.
On purpose.
On purpose. And what was actually created was a device called the Jenkins radio camera, which is kind of like an early Xerox machine, where it would take these sound impulses and then print them out in sort of the sequence that they came and form a picture. Well, guess what? These two guys that made the Jenkins radio camera got this transmission. What they got back was a series of dots and dashes in a specific repeating pattern. And then above that was a picture of, take a guess, a face. The profile of a humanoid, but not human face.
Much like Cydonia?
Much like the face on Cydonia. But the weird thing is, George, it's a profile, and when you flip it and look at it, you know what it really looks like? It looks like Voldemort from the Harry Potter movies. I mean, flat nose, and it is creepy how much it looks like that. Now, I'm not saying, Voldemort lives on Mars, but certainly there was some...
weird.
It could have been a representation of a Martian of some kind, or it could be that the people that made the Harry Potter movies had seen this and said, that's a good look for our villain. Let's make him look like that. But anyway, the thing that strikes me about it is that you had this very well publicized a lunch event where the Marconi guy talks about doing this. Then you had an opposition in 1922, and I tend to think the Navy must have sent a signal out, and then they decided to have this National Day of Radio Silence to see if they got an answer back. And the weird thing is it looks like it does. They did, and in fact, it's a face. So it brings us again back to this whole thing about Mars and faces.
The face on Mars.
Yeah.
Greg Molinar, Vince DiPietro, people like Richard Hoagland, all of them investigating this face on Mars. We're all disappointed when they got a global surveyor picture was at it of the mesa, and it looked like, where's the face?
Yeah.
It's gone. What do you think that thing is?
Well, it's artificial. And the thing is, a lot of those pictures were taken at very bad camera angles. Some would say deliberately bad camera angles. There's at least one image of the face on Mars, the one, the so-called cat box image, that it's been proven by independent researchers that they deliberately de-resed it and made it look as
I mean, there's no comparison.
It looks like nothing, yeah. But then we've had more honest pictures, like from the European Space Agency, more direct overhead views, and what you can see is that the platform, for instance, there's two parallel lines on the sides, hundreds of meters long, absolutely straight, absolutely parallel. The top of the platform is rounded, the bottom is rounded, exactly the same radius. That alone, if you were to see that on the Earth, if you were to see just that part of it, you'd say, that's an artificial structure.
Somebody made that.
We have to go dig that up and see what's there. That doesn't even get into things like the eyeball. There's actually an eyeball there. There's a pupil. There's a tear duct. There's nostrils in the nose. There's portions of a mouth that go through. There's another matching eye socket on the other side. And then when you get into the really high resolution stuff, which I've been looking at lately, down to like, you could should be able to see the size of this table kind of stuff. You see places where the structure of the face has actually collapsed, like a roof has caved in, and you can see the scaffolding and structure and bars and things that were used to hold that roof up on the face itself. So there's no question it's artificial, and I think you could prove that about 6 ways from Sunday.
How big is it?
Well, it's about 1.5 miles long and about 1 mile wide.
That's
so it's a
big.
very large object. Definitely intended to be seen from orbit.
Made out of a natural structure that was there?
It does not appear to be made out of a natural structure, because we've got thermal infrared images which will tell us about compositions, and what you see is that the left side, this side that's exposed, is something, it appears to be made up of something different than the other side, which is more rock-like.
Okay.
And that's very metallic, and on certain early morning shots that were done by some of the thermal infrared imagery, you actually can see geometric panels that are lined up with the actual north-south of the face, which is off at an angle, not north-south of the image scan or anything like that. So you can see that it's more metallic, and it glows in the dark like metal would.
Oh, wow.
And then this is where you see the collapsed roofs and all these other things. So when you get into the deep details, it looks like a face from far away, looks like a face from close up. I've even heard stories that they've taken people through tours of JPL, and they showed them a picture of the face, and they say, and of course some people thought this looked like a face, but you can all see it doesn't look like. And then people in the crowd will go, well, I think it looks like a face. So, it's and it's not pareidoia. There's no such thing.
You can only really see it and make it out by looking at it from above.
From above.
Much like the Nazca lines in Peru.
Yeah.
So what would its purpose be?
Its purpose would be to attract attention, to say, hey, this is the place where you're going to find your destiny. I think literally it was, the whole complex there was built as a monument to us from our ancestors for when we reached the point that we could come back and actually look down there again, to know that that's where we came from and that's where we should
What
land.
if they knew they were leaving the planet for whatever reason? We'll get into the Tom Van Flandern theory in a second. And so they said, we need to leave we're going to that planet up there called Earth. We need to leave something behind for our youngsters and their kids and their children, so that one day they can look at our planet, our homeland, and know where we came from, where our real roots were. Might they have made this structure as just a memorial to the people who lived on Mars, who came to planet Earth?
Well, they could have, they would have, I think they did, but it's not just that, it's all the other stuff around it. And remember that all these other very unusual looking objects, there's a 5-sided pentagonal pyramid, it's symmetrical about 2 different axes, and there's little pyramids all over the place. They all have this mathematical arrangement, and that arrangement actually projects a theory of physics which time after time, test after test, has proven out to be a better theory than the current relativity and all that stuff that we have now. So it appeared that it was to impart more than just the fact that they were there, but also that, hey, there's more to this universe, there's more to the universe itself than you actually think. And here's another part where it gets really weird. The whole face on Mars thing in Voldemort is pretty weird. But in the late 1950s, Jack Kirby wrote a comic called The Face on Mars.
Way before we knew anything about
anybody had ever supposedly seen the face on Mars. And it was about an expedition of astronauts that goes to Mars. They discover this human face on Mars, which looks like the face on Mars. And one of the astronauts crawls up into the eyeball and falls in. And when he falls in, he starts to have this vision of the civilization that built it. And this is a civilization of giants, peaceful giants, right out of Sitchin and Anunnaki, the Anunnaki. They had this peaceful civilization. They lived on a planet that Mars appeared to be orbiting another very large planet. And then all of a sudden they were invaded, and these invaders looked like machines. And they had a war with these machines. They eventually had to move underground, and finally the only way that they could end the war was to destroy the planet that the machines came from, which, if you look at the comic, it appears to be right next to them. And that's what completely devastated the surface of Mars, and then required them, apparently, to leave Mars and come to Earth. So the conclusion of the comic book is exactly the scenario you just outlined. And this is in 1958. It said that they couldn't live there anymore. It was devastated, so they had to come to the next best habitable place, which was
And they were lucky it was here. They really were. And in the comic book, is the face looking up?
Yeah, the face is
Same way.
actually the
It's
face.
just the
It's
same
flat.
way.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's just exactly like the face. It's just this part of it, and it's amazing to actually look at this and realize that it was
How did he
created.
know?
I don't know. I mean,
He's dead now, right?
Well, he's dead, but I had heard that he knew people like von Braun and Willy Ley at NASA. I've since been told that's not true. So who asked him to do this? Who,
I mean,
did he know
it's
Arthur
just
C.
too
Clarke?
similar.
Yeah, and there's no question that it's definitely the story.
If you enjoyed this, make sure to watch the next video on AwakenZone. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, but you won't want to miss what's coming next.